When you think of schizophrenia, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Well, if you're a horror fan like me, the image that you conjure up might even be terrifying. A depraved killer completely detached from reality, like in Psycho or The Joker.
What do you get?
I don't think so.
When you cross a mentally ill loner with a society that abandons him and beats him like trash!
Call the police,
I'll tell you what you
Call the police.
Get what you fucking deserve!
Mainstream news outlets often use schizophrenia as a way to explain the actions of violent people, like James Egan Holmes, Ed Gein, and David Berkowitz, better known as the son of Sam, who allegedly killed 6 people in the 70s because his neighbor's dog told him to do it. With only that as your frame of reference, it sounds pretty scary, right? But what if I told you that all that was little better than a ghost story and you actually have nothing to fear? Well, not nothing. We still don't know what's at the bottom of the ocean. Could be Cthulhu for all we know, man. But no, when it comes to cases of schizophrenia in real life, it's much different than what the mainstream media would lead you to believe. And in fact, I'd even go so far as to say that there is more danger in the average person misunderstanding schizophrenia than there is in just the average person who has the disorder. Now, before we go too much farther, there are just a couple disclaimers I need to get out of the way. I am not a mental health professional, and so nothing that I say in this video can be taken as medical advice. If you are experiencing some of the symptoms that I'm about to mention, please consult a doctor. Neither am I a person who lives with schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder, and so I really do need to thank the content creators out there who live with the disorder and are brave enough to talk about their experience so publicly, without whom this video would have been really impossible to make. In particular, I'd like to recommend the YouTube channel Living with Schizophrenia, run by Lauren, a very open and honest person who lives with schizoaffective disorder. I'd also recommend pretty much anything by Rachel Starr Withers, who lives with both schizophrenia and depression, but she's also just a really chill and funny person.
And we don't want to be normal anyway. We're cool.
You can find her on her YouTube channel, Rachel Starr Live, or on the podcast that she hosts, Inside Schizophrenia. And for the record, I also checked out pretty much every episode of the podcast Schizophrenia, 3 Moms in the Trenches, which takes a more family-oriented approach to the disorder, but I'd also recommend being cautious with checking that one out if you do live with some sort of mental illness. There are some really good bits of information in there, and they do interview both medical professionals and real people living with the disorder. But at the same time, just as a person with mental illness myself, I do find that they can be sometimes just a little bit dismissive. They'll sometimes speak as though they're mourning the son that they lost, which they didn't necessarily lose a son from my perspective. Like, this is the child that God, the universe, whatever you want to believe in, intended for you to have, and they're just as beautiful after diagnosis as they were before. To me personally, it feels a little dismissive, but that being said, I'm fully aware that I do not come from their background, I do not know them personally, and I would never want to cast judgment on someone who is very clearly struggling. But that does bring me to my final, not really disclaimer, but like thing that I wanted to say. Although I am not a person living with schizophrenia myself, I do have a mental illness. Without going into too much detail, I'm currently kind of going through the rehabilitation process for a complex PTSD. It's something I have dealt with pretty much as far back as I can remember, and it's definitely shaped both my worldview and the way that I've been treated by people throughout my life. And all that being true, I'm also a cinephile. In times in my life when it was honestly easier to disassociate than just continue struggling, movies were a very easy thing to turn to. And I will admit that it might have gotten to the point where I'd have issues separating movie logic from reality. I knew movies better than reality, so of course that's what I did. But at a certain point, I think I just got tired of experiencing all my life through movies. That's why in the last 2 years, I've moved away from my family, handfasted my actually supportive partner, and started the process towards rehabilitation. I decided to do this right before COVID though, so don't think it's been this great and shining journey. I'm honestly just way too stubborn to give up. And weirdly enough, I think part of this process, for me at least, has been confronting the movies that I grew up with and comparing them to the realities that I'm now actually forcing myself to live in for once. I know these people as characters, but now I want to know how warped that makes my perception. And honestly, the more that I learned about schizophrenia, the more I became convinced that this might be an important video for me to make, because I don't think that I'm alone in misunderstanding what this disorder is. I think that movies and mainstream media have done a lot of harm to real people living with this disorder. And there is something that we can do about that, even if it's just as simple as educating ourselves. You know, maybe having a deeper understanding of schizophrenia won't change the world for everyone living with this disorder, but it might change the way that you deal with them, and that might change the world for one person living with schizophrenia. Because here's the other thing that I've kind of learned in my research. We often think of schizophrenia as this completely debilitating disease where the minute that you get it, then, you know, that's it, you're gone. But that attitude is nothing more than dismissive and toxic because schizophrenia is a disorder you can live with. It is true that you will need medication to manage it, and not all people with schizophrenia are able to reach the same level of functioning that they were at before diagnosis. But that doesn't mean that a full and happy life isn't possible. You know, it's estimated that 10 years after diagnosis, 50% of people with schizophrenia will either be fully recovered or at least recovered enough to live independently. And even if you aren't able to live independently, even if you require a caregiver and you can't work full time, that doesn't mean that you can't work part time or produce beautiful art or work from home or just be a beautiful human being whose value isn't dependent on how much you produce for society. Some people contribute more to the home, maybe by doing the dishes or just being that person who listens really well, and that's valid too. You may still live with hallucinations or delusions, but that doesn't mean that you can't learn to recognize them for what they are and live with them. Just like many of us learn to live with chronic illness. And the funny thing is, before starting research for this, I thought that I'd never met a person with schizophrenia. But when I really thought about it, I realized that I actually have. I met my great aunt on one occasion when I was a kid, and before we went to meet her, everyone just kept telling me to be careful around her because she hears voices and does strange things. Which, to be fair, it doesn't necessarily mean that she was schizophrenic because she never received a proper diagnosis. But when I look back, I do realize how tragic the situation was. Like, on the one hand, I do understand it. My great aunt came from a different time. Her and my grandparents were like my age, maybe just a little bit younger when the last lobotomy was performed. So maybe it was a time where there was not only more fear around mental health, but also more fear around seeking help for mental health. So yeah, on the one hand, I can completely understand why my family chose to just shut her out and forget about her when she started to show symptoms of schizophrenia. But at the same time, I'm acutely aware of how dangerous that attitude is, because that's the exact same attitude they showed to me when I started to show symptoms of depression and anxiety. I do think these stigmas stick with us in ways that we don't fully understand. It's the fear of being crazy, of being misunderstood, of being outcast by society because of something that you literally can't control. And there's no reason for us to be living in such fear. People do need support and understanding in order to heal, especially from something like a mental illness. You wouldn't leave a broken leg to fester. That's obviously how it gets worse. So why do we think that it's okay to deny care to those who need it in emotional terms? Is emotional labor really that difficult for us at this point? In cases where people with schizophrenia have improved considerably after diagnosis, it's usually noted that they have a supportive family or community behind them, which makes it all the more tragic that there's so much misinformation out there. As someone with a mental illness myself, I personally like to have the belief that we're all on the same journey. Whether you have bipolar disorder or depression or schizophrenia, we're all the same. We're all plagued by health issues that we didn't ask for and don't want. We have to deal with doctors that may not always be the most understanding, medication with crappy side effects. So if there's one thing that we can do to make life easier for this community, then let's do it. And before we get into the movies, I guess this video is dedicated to my great aunt Barbara Fritz. I may have been born in the wrong generation to help you, but at least I can retroactively show my support with this. Don't even know if she's alive, to be honest, so she'll never see this. Anyway, that's enough heavy stuff for now. I did need to say that, otherwise I wouldn't feel good making this video, so thank you to everyone who sat with me. If you did, and you know someone with schizophrenia, then maybe comment their name down below, or if you're not comfortable with that, then maybe just their relationship to you. I don't know, just might be cool to flood the comment section with. Anyway, let's talk about Psycho, a movie my great aunt definitely would have been at least familiar with. The weird thing about Psycho is that I'm not entirely sure if Norman Bates even is schizophrenic or if his diagnosis would be something closer to dissociative identity disorder. Another thing that I'm kind of considering on doing a video on in the future, by the way. I feel like that's another one that has a lot of fear and stigma and misunderstanding built up around it because of horror movies and the media, so it's one that I'd like to look at, but as I haven't started the research process for it yet, I'll probably say more on that in that video. But for now, suffice it to say that schizophrenia is not a split personality. What it actually is sort of difficult to explain, which might be part of the reason why it's hard to understand. So basically, schizophrenia refers to a set of positive symptoms and negative symptoms that affects around 1% of the population. Now in this situation, positive doesn't necessarily mean good, it means additive. So think of it sort of like you take a neurotypical person, but then they suddenly start experiencing these positive symptoms that start happening to their day-to-day experience. An example of positive symptoms might be hallucinations, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a little bit. You may also experience delusions, confused thought, or disordered thinking. A negative symptom, on the other hand, is something that subtracts from your day-to-day experience. So for example, you may experience a flattening of pleasure and other emotions, or a withdrawal from social interaction. Or you may simply find it difficult to complete mundane tasks, like getting out of bed or washing yourself. Not everyone experiences the same positive or negative symptoms, by the way. For example, I've heard it said that men might experience more of that flattening of emotions, whereas women might experience more heightened hallucinations. But again, that varies from person to person. As you may have noticed, some of the less intense symptoms of schizophrenia somewhat resemble symptoms of depression. And so it isn't uncommon for people to be misdiagnosed as depressed until positive symptoms start showing up, such as delusions or hallucination, which may be difficult to recognize as such without the input of another person. Some people with schizophrenia may even develop paranoias around seeking help, such as developing delusions that the doctors want to hurt them. And when this happens, it may be up to a loved one to convince them to seek help, or even have them admitted in the worst of cases. In the case of Norman Bates, Anthony Perkins did choose to portray him with a stutter.
My mother, what is the phrase?
But this isn't necessarily what they're referring to when they say disordered speaking. Schizophrenia is a thought disorder. So from what I understand, it'll sort of be like you're thinking about one thing, but then it suddenly jumps to another topic before you can even finish your first thought. Your brain is just making these seemingly random connections resulting in word salad, which may not make sense to someone on the outside who's just seeing you make these seemingly random connections. Or you may just stop talking altogether because your thoughts just aren't making sense. Norman Bates' stutter, on the other hand, seems to be more of an attempt on the filmmaker's part to infantilize him, something that they're constantly doing by having him carry around a bag of candy and by decorating his bedroom like a little boy's. This is supposed to connect back to his trauma in a way. I think I need to do more research on what causes this because I know it isn't everyone who's experienced childhood trauma, but there are some people who are just emotionally stunted by it so that they're just unable to emotionally develop past the age of like 9, 10, 14, whatever happened to them. This is something that happens. In my case, it didn't. I think partly because my trauma forced me to grow up very fast. I experienced a minor surge of adolescence at 24 and then very quickly decided that that just didn't settle with my core self and became an old crone at 26. Give me comfy hoodies, cats, and tea over the stress of being assaulted in a bar any day. But if you do find yourself coping with trauma by reverting to a more immature mindset, then it is recommended that you seek out professional guidance, as this may be a sign that you're just not dealing with it in an especially healthy way. The other potential symptom of schizophrenia that Norman Bates shows is hallucinations, which the movies seem to imply are more auditory than visual. In all 4 of the original Anthony Perkins movies, we never see Mrs. Bates move or even open her mouth to talk, which suggests that Norman is only hearing her voice and believing the source to be his mother's corpse, an obvious delusion to us since we know that corpses can't talk. For the record, I do think that the novel gets this idea across a little better because Mrs. Bates is never visually described in the book. She's never even described like entering a room or making an expression or moving anything around. She literally just comes across as a disembodied voice the entire time. which may make the twist ending a little bit more obvious, but personally I read the book after seeing the movie anyway, so I was really just struck by how much more interested Robert Bloch seemed to be in representing auditory hallucinations than Alfred Hitchcock was. Now, is this an accurate portrayal of auditory hallucinations? Kind of. From what I understand, the voices do tend to exist externally. We tend to think of the voices of being in your head, and maybe from our perspective they are, but to the person actually suffering hallucinations, it's much more difficult to distinguish them from someone just talking to you. It isn't entirely unheard of for auditory hallucinations to be of people that you have known either. For example, I listened to one interview with a veteran who would hear the voices of soldiers that he served with. But more often than not, voices appear to just be voices. I often hear people with schizophrenia describe them as an androgynous voice or a man's voice, which leads me to believe that it's just a voice. There are a number of schizophrenia simulators on YouTube that can kind of show you what it's like to experience auditory hallucinations. But keep in mind, from what I understand, these simulators show you what it's like to be in deep psychosis. It's not necessarily showing you the day-to-day experience of someone on medication. And also, experiences may vary.
Grab it all. Eat all the food.
Don't touch that.
Eat it all.
Don't touch that.
Bother getting out of bed.
The simulators often have multiple voices whispering over each other in a manner that honestly sort of reminds me of the video game Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, which features a player character who experiences auditory hallucinations.
Deep into darkness. There will be no more stories after this one.
Going back to Norman Bates, I saved the most obvious detail for last. He's a murderer. Schizophrenic killers have become something of a trend in pop culture since Norman Bates. There are a number of examples that I could try to rope in here, but in particular, I want to talk about the 2015 movie The Voices, which, okay. This movie was directed by Marjane Satrapi, who wrote the graphic novel Persepolis, which is undeniably one of the most important graphic novels of our generation. It talks a lot about her experience growing up as a woman in Iran. Her voice is very important, and I'm so glad to see women like her making movies with people like Ryan Reynolds, who definitely is a talented actor. Now, I'm gonna talk about this movie's treatment of schizophrenia. Like with Norman Bates, Jerry here appears to be suffering from multiple mental illnesses. For example, IMDb diagnoses him with schizophrenia, OCD, and DID. But for the sake of this video, we're only gonna focus on his more obvious schizophrenic symptoms, and considering the movie's title literally draws attention to them, don't think that's entirely inappropriate. For the record, I will not be talking about Split in this video because even though it gets talked about as being a movie about schizophrenia, I honestly saw way more DID to the point that I literally couldn't think of anything to even vaguely allude to. Anyway, going back to the voices. Jerry's tendency to react to his visual hallucinations and other people viewing him as weird for it seems to be fairly accurate. He also experiences auditory hallucinations that he believes to be coming from his pets, which I have to admit, it does strike me that we have this tendency to want to ground these voices down to like an object or an animal. Like, it can't just be a voice seemingly coming from nowhere. It needs to be a voice coming from something the audience can see, but also something that we logically know can't talk, like a dead body or a cat. I have to admit, I was having a hard time finding research on how common it would be for people with schizophrenia to hear just the same voice with a distinct personality coming from a singular source like this. Like, not even hearing multiple voices, no disembodied voices or anything. It's just like, you know, you talk to your cat. That's your only hallucination/delusion. I just want to know how common that is. If anyone has a medical degree and actually does know, please let me know, because from what I've come to understand, the only way that that would be possible would be if your auditory hallucinations started to merge with your delusions. Like, not only are you hearing voices, you've now constructed an entire story about where they're coming from and who they are, and I'm just not entirely sure if that's super common. While I was researching for this video, my partner did mention that they used to have a friend with schizophrenia who heard squirrels talking to him. But even with that, it isn't like it's just one squirrel with the same voice and the same personality and like this whole existence outside of you, basically. I don't know, I'm really leaning on this being an over-exaggeration for storytelling purposes. And yes, I know that there's the whole Son of Sam situation where he killed 6 people because he believed that his neighbor's dog told him to do it. I can't say too much because I didn't like talk to the guy. I haven't researched that case super hard or anything. But from my understanding, that would be more of a delusion. It wouldn't work the way that it does in movies. Like, the dog is literally walking next door to his house, opening his mouth and saying, "Hey buddy, you gotta kill some people." Like, that's not happening. It's more like he has developed this delusion in his head that the dog has said, "You need to kill people." That's, from what I understand, more how it works. But I have to admit that I do hold journalists accountable a lot of the time in stories like that for spreading misinformation. You know, the specific language that you use and the parts of the story that you choose to focus on does have power. And journalists in the past haven't had a tendency to think about that. They just really consider, you know, what's the biggest story? What's gonna sell more papers? That often comes at the expense of thousands of people. And that brings us right back to where we started. We have Norman Bates, we have Jerry, we have Son of Sam. Are schizophrenic people violent killers? Honestly, you guys, after everything that I've been saying, I think it's pretty clear that they're not. There is no psychological reason why a schizophrenic person would be more prone to murder. Although that isn't to say that complications can't arise during a period of unmedicated psychosis. Most of which can be avoided, however, with proper support and treatment. For example, one of the mothers on Schizophrenia, 3 Moms in the Trenches, speaks about how her son once developed the delusion that his mother had been replaced with an imposter and he needed to kill her to get his real mother back. And although she does admit that this was a difficult time for the family, with love, support, understanding, and a bit of help from doctors and support groups like NAMI, they were able to work through it without any issue. But that being said, violent delusions do seem to be extremely rare, or at least cases of people acting on them definitely are. I have also heard some people with schizophrenia say that if they're in deep psychosis and their hallucinations are particularly frightening, and someone tries to rush at them or restrain them, then they might try to defend themselves. But again, that's a situation that can be avoided with a better understanding of what schizophrenia is and how we can respond in a crisis situation. If you do find yourself in a crisis situation with someone who has schizophrenia, it may be best to get the authorities involved. And if that's the case, make sure to request an officer who has received crisis training, as these are special officers who are better equipped to deal with people who might be in the midst of psychosis. Because here's another thing that we need to mention. People with schizophrenia are about 14 times more likely to be the victim of a violent crime than they are to be arrested for committing a violent crime. And a lot of this does have to do with the stigma and fear that's been created by the media. For instance, one unfortunately very common form of aggression that people with schizophrenia may face is simply in the home. Mental illness tends to put a lot of stress on the family, especially when it's a mental illness that makes people act in a way that they normally wouldn't. As much as I do want to remove stigma here, I won't deny that it can be damaging to hear your loved one speak to you as though they don't know you, as though you're capable of doing things to them that you aren't. And that damage can sometimes breed hostility, and something that's known as caregiver burnout if you're the primary one trying to help this person. And caregiver burnout does limit your capacity for empathy, something that's especially hard to reach in a world that honestly just doesn't have empathy for people with schizophrenia. In the worst of cases, you can kind of see where I'm going with this. Obviously, all of this can be avoided, but only if you're able to recognize what's going on and seek the proper treatment. Substance abuse is also a common coping mechanism for many people with schizophrenia. One thing that I found sort of interesting in my research was that nicotine addiction is actually a rampant problem amongst people with schizophrenia, because nicotine actually reduces some of the more harmful effects of medication. I don't know, I just found that interesting. But anyway, substance abuse does put people at a higher risk for homelessness as well, especially schizophrenic men for a multitude of reasons, among them being that there are simply fewer services put in place in Western society to protect men from homelessness. Psychosis also has a tendency to make people very vulnerable. For example, you might be more susceptible to what neurotypical people would consider outlandish beliefs on account of your delusions. Or it may be as simple as walking in front of a car in the state of psychosis. The way that the authorities respond to people with schizophrenia also has an effect on this statistic. That's not to say that cops can't handle crisis situations well, but as I mentioned before, rushing at people who are in the state of psychosis or getting too aggressive can make them feel attacked. And if a schizophrenic person tries to defend themselves, then more often than not, they're the ones that end up hurt. But that's all boring reality. Let's get back to fiction for a second. Now that we've established the conditions under which a schizophrenic person may become violent, does Psycho and The Voices do an accurate job of portraying that? In Psycho, Norman Bates' first murder is motivated by pure jealousy. His mother starts spending more time with her husband than with him, and so he kills them both. There may be an argument that he killed them out of revenge for the abuse that he suffered in his childhood, the nature of which is never made entirely clear. But the primary motivator does seem to be the inclusion of that third person in the relationship. I don't think I need to say it, but this has nothing to do with his schizophrenia. Unless you want to argue that Norman was deluded enough to believe that he was in a sexual relationship with his mom. But even that can technically be refuted because, again, we don't actually know what the nature of that abuse was. From that point forward, Norman does hear his mother's voice mocking women that he finds attractive. But to be fair, she never does tell him to kill them himself. She takes on the duty of killing these women herself, doing it through Norman's body, which seems to imply, this weird merging between schizophrenia symptoms and DID symptoms. Honestly, I just have no idea what's going on here. Yes, schizophrenia does cause delusions, and those delusions can affect the way that you think people perceive you. But it usually isn't this drastic. More commonly, you're walking around thinking that you're some prophet sent to save the world, not literally and physically your own mother. So yeah, Norman Bates is just a complete failure at representing schizophrenia. I'm sorry. But what about Jerry? What's his motivation? Well, he just kinda oopses his way into it, I guess. One thing that I should mention before we go too much further is that this movie is a horror comedy, so yeah.
Sorry I killed you guys.
Let's not bring up the bad things. Let's just be happy.
Her mother had schizophrenia before him, and when his father contacted the authorities to have her forcibly committed, she decided that they were coming to hurt her. I would say that this was a delusion that she had developed, but I have to admit I don't know a whole lot about how mental health was handled in Germany when this movie was supposed to take place, so I'll just leave my statement at that. Fearful of the fate that awaited her at the institution, she begged 9-year-old Jerry to kill her. And so he did. From that point forward, every time he kills a woman, it appears to be in moments that remind him of that initial trauma, indicating that this may be more of a PTSD trigger response than anything related to schizophrenia. Again, none of this seems to track with the average experience of anyone with these disorders. And I'm sorry for playing armchair psychologist with these characters. I wouldn't be doing it if they weren't fictional. I'm just fascinated by mental health, fascinated by stories, and trying to draw connections based off of what I know. I'm not saying that these characters have these disorders, and I'm also not saying that you're anything like these characters if you do. And I'd also just like to reiterate that people with schizophrenia are very seldom violent. And it's actually very dangerous to label schizophrenia as a scary or violent mental illness because this does dissuade people from seeking help when they start noticing symptoms. They don't want to be the person who hears voices. In fact, the stigma is so bad that some mental health professionals actually refuse to diagnose children with schizophrenia because they think it's cruel to force them to live with that label from such a young age. So apparently, the better option is just to not treat them. I can't even imagine if every single time I introduced myself to a new person, I knew they were thinking in the back of their head that I was a violent murderer. They don't even know me yet, and that's already what they're thinking? Really? Moving on, so that this video isn't a million years long, we have yet another way that movies tend to depict people with schizophrenia with The Exorcism of Emily Rose. Exorcisms in general have been used as a very archaic form to treat people with all sorts of mental illnesses. Like, for example, I once had a friend whose parents had her exorcised for depression, which is just insane to me. But similar to how lobotomies get connected to schizophrenia patients when they were really just kind of used on anyone they didn't like back then, there was a heavy emphasis on people whose presentation didn't necessarily match their assigned gender, just saying. We often connect exorcisms to the idea of schizophrenia just because it seems the most obvious, I guess. Schizophrenic people are seeing things that aren't there. Possessed people are seeing demons. hey, they must be possessed. Out of all of the exorcism movies that I could have chosen to talk about here, I chose The Exorcism of Emily Rose just because it may be linked to a real case of schizophrenia. Well, kind of. Anneliese Michel was a German woman who was diagnosed with depression shortly after she began treatment for temporal lobe epilepsy. Shortly thereafter, she also began experiencing hallucinations with heavily Christian themes, including seeing what she would describe as devil faces, and hearing voices that would tell her that she was damned and that she was gonna rot in hell. She did begin receiving treatment for psychosis, but her mother revealed at one point that she may not have been taking her medication properly. And a friend of the family became convinced that Anneliese must be possessed when they noticed that she refused to drink from a holy spring or walk past a crucifix. At that point, Anneliese's parents ceased all treatment for their daughter and contacted the church requesting an exorcism. 67 exorcisms were performed in total, during which Anneliese would voluntarily flog herself to rid herself of the demons. And this is like the most upsetting part to me. When she became too weak to flog herself, her mom would step in to do it. Anneliese died of malnutrition and dehydration. Her knees had been broken by the floggings, and at some point she had contracted pneumonia that had gone untreated. She weighed only 66 pounds at the time of her death and would not have been able to move around on her own. I'm sorry, I know that some people do believe in demons, and if you do, this might come across as a creepy story of possession or whatever. But personally, all that I can see here is an innocent person who was manipulated into believing that they were evil because they had a mental illness, and then they were slowly tortured to death. And I'm a spiritual person. I will admit that I don't believe in demons necessarily, but I do believe in negative energy, and I believe that it might have an effect on us. I don't know, in some sort of way that might be similar to possession. I don't know. But I find this case very similar to the Amityville murders in that it's just it's clearly just gross people manipulating people's fears to get away with the crime they so obviously committed. Her parents were charged with negligent homicide, but they were given suspended prison sentences. And the state even said that the parents had suffered enough and that they didn't deserve any punishment for denying their daughter access to medical care and then slowly torturing her to death. And then we made a movie about how it was all demons. If that isn't revealing about how we as a society feel about people with schizophrenia, then I really don't know what is. Moving on to something a little bit more recent, both the Joker and Harley Quinn have gotten schizophrenic makeovers that I don't really remember being there in the comics. Okay, maybe Harley with that little beaver thing that she was talking to for a little bit, but again, not a great depiction of auditory hallucinations. But I think that brings me to something that I've definitely noticed with schizophrenia in the media. Filmmakers really like to over-dramatize hallucinations for visual effect. In a comic form, it's impossible to represent auditory hallucinations unless you're doing it in a text box, which isn't quite so immersive and atmospheric as a movie would be. And while visual hallucinations are possible in a comic form, writers are usually confronted with the problem of wasting space. True hallucinations can be random, but when you write, the first piece of advice that you're given is to scrap everything that isn't necessary to progress the plot or the theme. In order to represent true hallucinations, that would need to be the author's primary intent. But most writers aren't concerned with representing schizophrenia accurately. They're concerned with progressing the story, especially when you're dealing with something like DC Comics. So if hallucinations do appear in connection to Harley Quinn or the Joker in comic form, it's typically much too organized and plot-driven to be an accurate representation. In the Joker movie, he again displays symptoms of multiple mental illnesses, not all of them being ones that I can guess at. He often responds to people in ways that would be considered socially inappropriate, but judging by context clues in the movie, this seems to be more of a stress response than the result of disordered thinking. For instance, he laughs uncontrollably when he gets nervous. I'm not going to say that the Joker doesn't show signs of disorganized thinking, but more than anything, the biggest symptom of schizophrenia that he shows is delusions, such as believing himself to be a comic genius when no one's actually laughing at him in a good way. I do want to give this movie credit for its extremely scathing commentary on the mental health system, as it's only after the Joker is cut off from his systems of support that honestly weren't really that supportive to begin with anyway, that he starts going down an extremely dark path. It can also be assumed that he stops taking his medication after the government defunds the mental health services, which is a factor in his downfall that I never really considered before. But otherwise, this is about as accurate a portrayal as Norman Bates. Well, what about Harley? The first Suicide Squad movie has her deliver this line.
Hey, everyone can see all this trippy magic stuff, right?
Yeah, why?
I'm off my meds.
Every single movie since then has utilized this idea of her hallucinating, or being delusional maybe, for visual effect. Such as in the new Suicide Squad movie, where flowers burst out of her while she musically shoots people. And Birds of Prey, where she hallucinates herself into Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend. Which is not only an extreme example of hallucinations, it may also be worth mentioning that this is more of an example of her disassociating, as she's literally using it as a coping mechanism to escape torture. But I know that some audiences are going to see this as a hallucination, so it's worth mentioning anyway. Again, all of this is just to serve the plot and get across this vague idea that she may hallucinate without actually tying it to any real symptoms of schizophrenia. Another thing that may be worth mentioning is the cause of schizophrenia, considering abuse has factored heavily into all of the stories that we've talked about so far. And there actually isn't any evidence connecting schizophrenia to abuse. Doctors aren't entirely sure of the cause yet, but the lead-in theory is that it's hormonal, considering most of the treatments focus heavily on dopamine regulation. Although having a family history of schizophrenia will increase your likelihood of getting it, as will heavy marijuana use at a young age. So yeah, it's totally possible to come from a loving household and be surrounded by nothing but good people all your life, and still have schizophrenia. But that does bring me to a sort of off-topic, sort of not rant about Harley, which is that I really feel like she's turned into an infinitely weaker character in recent years. There's a lot less focus on the abuse that she suffered basically her entire life, and a lot more focus on turning her into the poster child for mental illness is cute. Which is especially disappointing to me because I will admit that there was a time where Harley Quinn was one of my all-time favorite characters. I found that I related to her a lot because she was a people pleaser who often found herself surrounded by abusive people. But at the same time, she always had a smile to give everyone. She was always making jokes, and she was always a good friend to people like Ivy, who actually lifted her up and tried to change her worldview. You know, she wasn't just some wilting wallflower cowering away from an overly aggressive man. Harley, to me, was evidence that you could be both a strong person and an abuse victim at the same time. But I know that we wanted to progress the story. We didn't want to see her being abused by the Joker forever. We wanted her to be happy, and the fact of the matter is, abuse is a heavy subject to explore. Most people do not leave abusive situations and jump straight into a happy and fulfilling life. It usually takes time and healing and treatment before you can even begin to imagine having genuine connections with people again. So it's much easier to just ignore that he was ever abusive to begin with, and then have her move on to just completely unconnected mental illnesses. And it's just like, ugh. There are a plethora of mental illnesses that are actually connected to abuse. Why couldn't Harley be struggling with one of those, instead of just romanticizing this idea of hallucinations for visual effect? That being said, I do enjoy the recent animated Harley Quinn TV show. It has nothing to do with schizophrenia, but it is the best Harley Quinn product I've seen in a long time, and at least they actually acknowledge the abuse. I don't want to dwell on this movie too long because honestly, it's very vague on what mental illness it's supposed to be representing, but I would feel amiss if I didn't at least mention mental institution movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which does depict mental illnesses in an extremely negative light, and also sort of has this whole attitude of like, you don't have an illness, you can just go off your meds and live free, which honestly is kind of damaging to people who honestly do require their meds in order to function, especially when that medication does come with side effects that people would rather live without if they could, and when you might be dealing with delusions that tell you that you don't need them. I do, however, want to talk a little bit about Ken Casey, who wrote the novel that One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is based on. There's this book by Tom Wolfe called The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. I definitely recommend checking it out if you're into like drug-fueled hippie cults or stuff like that. It's very revealing about what sort of person Ken Casey was. The first thing that I do want to say is that while addiction is unhealthy, you're definitely not a bad person if you have ever suffered from it or if you're currently going through it. I would simply urge you to seek help from a doctor or a loved one. You are valid, you are loved. That being said, Ken Casey aims to create a religion that would center mostly around taking acid. He and a group of hippies toured the country in a van that was driven by Neil Cassidy, Jack Kerouac's muse. And he basically encouraged the women that he toured with to have sex with members of the Hells Angels in exchange for acid. All of that was after he wrote the book though, I just brought that up for context. Before he wrote the book, Ken Casey had actually participated in government studies that used mescaline and LSD in order to make some money. Around the same time, he was also working at an institution, and he came up with the idea for the book because he felt that he could relate to how the patients were being treated. I find all of this to be very revealing about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest because Ken Casey wasn't writing about mental illness at all. He was writing about drugs and the government. I think it's sort of obvious why this can be damaging. For one thing, it's just spreading misinformation. You and I might know that this story isn't about mental illness at all, but Sue on the street still thinks it is. And on the one hand, comparing schizophrenia to drugs can be sort of helpful because drugs are one way that neurotypical people can access a state of psychosis. So it might help normalize it a little bit when you realize that hallucinations are just something that everyone is capable of. Even without taking drugs, you can reach a certain state of psychosis simply by being overexhausted. It's a function of the brain, not some scary curse. But this comparison can also be very damaging because now we're dealing with two stigmas on top of each other. Sometimes when people who are dealing with hallucinations for the first time do seek medical help, doctors will just assume that they're high and that this is normal, it'll pass. They fail to consider the mental health aspect, and considering how difficult it is for people with schizophrenia to seek help in the first place, it really doesn't help when we have professionals turning them away like this. So yeah, as much as I'm glad that he existed, because this video definitely would have been a lot more boring without that story, maybe the Ken Caseys of the world should stop relating to schizophrenics. Because the last thing that we need is another privileged person talking over an oppressed group, says the privileged person currently speaking for an oppressed group. Complex PTSD may be something that I'm dealing with for the rest of my life, but that being said, I'm aware that I can manage it much easier than the average person with schizophrenia can, although I'm also aware that this isn't the suffering Olympics. I also know that I don't have to deal with stigma in the same way that someone with schizophrenia would. I'm not currently putting up with medication with borderline torturous side effects just because that's my only option. There is more research into the causes and treatments for PTSD than there is for schizophrenia. I'm aware of all of this. I fully encourage you to seek out actual schizophrenic voices and ask them what they need, what would improve their quality of life. You know, if anything, I'm not necessarily saying that every person with schizophrenia has like a long list of complaints. But at the same time, I do think that this message is important to get out there because this stigma does hurt people in ways that I was honestly privileged enough to not think about every time that I watched Psycho growing up. I just don't see enough people talking about this, to be honest. So if I can get this message out there to just one person who wouldn't have heard it otherwise, then I think it's worth it. And to be perfectly honest, I will probably watch Psycho again. Probably a lot. Hey, I'm non-binary. I was never unaware that the movie's problematic. But the next time that I watch it, I will do it with full awareness that the true victims of horror movies are the ones that we never see. We know Marion Crane's story. She's on screen. What we don't hear about are the people who watch that movie and then refuse to seek treatment, or potentially whose families suppress them from seeking treatment because of it. We don't know how many people watched that movie and just became afraid of their fellow human being for no reason. And there is no reason for us to live in fear. If If you were to go down to the description box, you would find the Amazon link to my book, Poor Pretty Creature, available wherever you can find ebooks. And well, I'm still here. Although it is completely unnecessary to donate, I do understand that a lot of people are struggling financially right now. I did just want to mention that I have a Patreon, which will be linked below, as well as give thanks to the people who already support me there. Andre K, Scott Falks, Thrill House, and Wilson L. Ricks III. Donations can be as little as $1 a month, but as I said, absolutely no pressure whatsoever. Your support means the world to me, but so does the support of every single person who gives a like or a comment or even just a view. I can't wait to see you all next time.